In this exercise, we're going to continue discussing how we can use both variations in value and variations in edges to create really nice paintings. But we're going to take it a little bit further and we're going to start exploring form. So for this exercise, there is a template available for you if you want to just transfer this onto your watercolor paper. This is going to be a 4-step exercise. We're going to look at using value and edges from very simple techniques to more advanced techniques to create a sense of form. And so there's also a photo reference for this exercise. It's just going to be this apple. And this is just a photo reference from a website called pixabay.com. It's a royalty-free resource for you where they have lots and lots of photographs that you can use, and that can be very useful for practicing your painting skills. So feel free to check that out. We're really going to be using that only as a rough guide for this exercise, so this by no means is something that you need to really study the photograph and create exact likenesses from it. I basically have created this template so that the apple is very simple in shape and form, and we're just going to focus, of course, on building up value and using edges to create a nice sense of form with this apple. Now for this first step, what we're going to be doing is just having 2 values. So basically white, the white of the paper, is going to be one of our values. And then we're going to be using just a single color. In my case, I chose blue to build up the other value, so the darker value. So this is basically going to be a 2-value picture, and we're going to see how well we can create a sense of form. Now you can see that basically what I'm doing is I'm allowing the background and then the shadow form on the apple to merge into a single shape. This in painting is called creating a lost edge. And for me personally, I like to create lost edges within my shadows for the most part. That doesn't mean you can't do it for your lighter values, but I tend to create lost edges for my shadows. And that's where all of those edges just become one, and we get a very abstract sense of form. And I think because we know that this is an apple, we can almost make sense out of this shape. But I think if you were looking at this all on its own, it would seem very abstract. And then I'm going to just soften up that edge where the shadow of the apple meets the light side of the apple. And all I did was just add a little bit of water to that hard edge while it was still wet. So for this next step, we're going to practice having 3 values, and we're going to use 2 colors to achieve this. So I'm going to start out with red. And again, white is going to be 1 value, but this time the only white that I'm going to leave is just going to be the highlight on the top of the apple on the light side. And everything else I'm going to just cover completely with red. I'm going to do my next value in 2 different steps. So while this is still wet, I'm going to go ahead and go back into my blue, and I'm going to start adding my next value, but I'm going to allow all of these edges to be very soft. And you're going to see that the water will start flowing even into the red of my apple, and I don't have a lot of control over that. And one thing that I think is really important for us to become comfortable with in watercolor painting is that when we're doing soft edges, sometimes you are going to have your edges flow together in ways that you maybe didn't envision or necessarily want. But rather than trying to control that and fiddle with it and kind of overworking your painting, it's just really good practice just to let it be. And I think that more times than not, you're actually going to find that those accidental convergences that you didn't really plan for or necessarily want actually add a lot of character to your painting. So go ahead and just let those be. So now I'm doing the next step. This is going to be approximately the same value that I already applied with the blue where it mixed in with the red. But this time I want to create some harder edges. And so I had used my hair dryer to go ahead and dry all of that pigment that I used to create the soft edges. And now I'm going in and in just a few areas, I am going to create some harder edges. I don't want to change that value a lot, of course, because I still just want this to be 3 values. But you'll see that compared to that first step, we will create a much more convincing sense of form by using 3 values rather than just 2. It's still pretty abstract. And I think that this is actually a little bit more interesting to look at. And we can begin to see that this is an apple, although it's still very abstract. But of course, in watercolor, we really want some of those abstract features. We want some areas to kind of be very soft and flowing and abstract. And then in just a few other areas, we'll add a little bit more structure. Now for the third step, I'm going to have 4 values and I'm going to use all 3 colors. So I'm actually going to start out with my yellow. And that's because yellow tends to be lightest in value. And so I will actually do this a lot, especially when I'm being a little bit more loose and abstract. I'm not paying so much attention to the actual color of the picture that I'm painting, and I'm paying more attention to just creating sense of value. I'll actually start out with a really light wash of yellow. Now it's hard to see here, but I left just that little bit of highlight on the apple white, and that's going to be the only area in this section that's going to remain completely white. And while this yellow layer is still wet, I'm going to go ahead and add in another color. I'll go with red, and this is going to be my second value, so it's going to be just a little bit darker, a little bit more concentrated than that yellow was. If you look on my palette up at the yellow that I mixed, there's a lot of water in there, not much pigment, and it's very light in value. For this red, I have a little bit more pigment in the mix, and I'm going to go ahead and just very loosely start applying this. I don't want to completely cover up the yellow because, of course, that is my first value, and so I do want some areas where that's just really showing through. And again, I'm not copying necessarily the coloration of the apple in the photo reference. The photo reference is really there as a guide for me to see where the light and shadow shapes are. And since I actually drew the main light and shadow shapes onto the template, you might find that it's actually easier for you to just follow along with the exercise without paying too much attention to the photo reference. Because a lot of times when we have a photo reference, we tend to see every little detail and feel like we are going to replicate every detail that we see in the photo. But for this exercise, it's really best just to keep it very simple. So now for my third value, I mixed up a nice violet, so I added some blue into that red. And everything here is still pretty wet. I have more pigment in this mix, so it's not quite as watery, but it certainly isn't the darkest value that I could possibly mix. But you can see that as things start to evaporate and dry on the paper, so the water is evaporating, I'm able to achieve slightly harder edges. I wouldn't call these really hard edges, but these are kind of intermediate. So there's just a little bit of flow between the edges, but not too much. I'm going to go ahead and dry that with my hair dryer before I add the final value and the hardest edges here. So I'm going to grab a lot more pigment. I'm not going to be using nearly as much water. I still want to use kind of a violet. So I'm mixing my blue in with the red, and now I'm going to go ahead and add some harder edges just to a few select areas to bring a lot of interest and structure into this painting. And this is really still quite abstract, especially because we have that nice lost edge between the shadow of the apple and the background. But you can definitely start to see that there is a little bit more form given to the apple, and it feels a little bit more tangible than in the previous 2 examples. And there's a time and place for everything. Generally speaking, anything that is not the focal point of your painting, you actually want to leave a little bit more abstract and loose so that it doesn't drive all that visual attention away from your main focus. So it really is very useful to know how to make something just appear a little bit more ethereal and soft so that it's not grabbing quite so much attention. Now for this final step, I'm going to go ahead and use colors at will. So basically, I'm trying to create a more realistic representation of the apple, but I'm still following the same concept of moving from my lightest values toward my darkest values and using my softer edges at first, and then going in the final stage with some of my harder edges and darkest values. So I'm starting out here again with just a little bit of pale yellow in the light side of the apple that's receiving more light, leaving that highlight white. And I'm just being a little bit more careful here. Whereas before I applied some of those washes over the entire square, here I'm being a little bit more reserved in where I apply things. So this is all still wet. I haven't dried anything off. And I've already got 3 values in here. I've got my lightest value up where the yellow is. I've got a secondary value where the red is. And then I went ahead and created this nice violet. And this is what I'm going to use basically for the remainder of the shadow areas. And I'm still going to have a little bit of a lost edge in here, but I'll add just a little bit more structure so that there's some delineation between even the shadow side of the apple and the background for this example. But I'm just letting everything really run together and be very soft at this point, focusing more on my value buildup. So obviously with this violet, I'm getting a little bit of a darker value, although I will be able to go even darker than this when I get ready to do my hard edge. But it's very important to note that I'm just allowing things to flow together. I haven't used quite as much water, and so I won't get a lot of flow between these edges, but they are all wet, and so there's going to be a little bit that's inevitable. And since I didn't use quite as much water in this one as I used in some of these previous examples, this is all going to dry quite a lot faster. And so I can build up to my darkest value and my hardest edges rather quickly. Now, on a side note, I want to also mention that when you are ready to add in your darkest values, you almost always are going to want everything to be dry. So even though you might want some soft edges, if you have everything very, very wet and you go in with your darkest value, you're going to end up actually removing some of the water that's still wet on your paper with your brush. And so then you're going to get some spotting. You're going to actually end up lifting some of your pigment out of your paper rather than adding more pigment in. So when you're ready to do your darkest values, you do want to make sure that your painting is, I would say, at least 90% dry at that point. So now you can see I'm going in and I'm able to achieve some nice hard edges because I didn't use so much water. It didn't take very long for this to dry up relatively well. And I'm using some hard edges to help delineate a little bit between the shadow side of the apple and then the background. I added just a little bit of darker value along the terminator of the form shadow. And you can see that there's a little bit of reflected light coming up onto that bottom part of the apple from the background. And what I'm going to do to help that kind of feel a little bit more natural is I'm going to end up using my hair dryer just to help this layer dry really, really well. And then I'm going to apply a final glaze of just pure blue. And that's going to really help bring that area together. And adding a glaze right to that area is just going to help it feel a little bit more unified as well. Because again, when I am working in the shadow areas, I really like things to kind of merge together a little bit, because usually my focal point is going to be in the area of the form that's receiving more light. And so I really want to kind of unify all of my shadows so that they're not drawing so much attention. So I'm just going over this with a glaze of my ultramarine blue just to help unify these shadows a little bit. And that's basically going to be it for this exercise. So this was basically a way to help you see that there's different ways to create form, different ways to use value from the more simple and abstract to the more realistic, and also how we can use that variety of edges to really create visual interest and help us to develop a nice focal point. So I hope that you enjoyed this. Remember that there is a template and a photo reference available to help you with this exercise, and just have fun with it.